Yo, life ain't easy when you born in a fight. Got the system on our backs, we stay hustling through the night. From the block.
It has cost me blood, sweat and tears, but believe me, I've been trying to solve a question that has haunted our subconscious for years. Do African Americans have lighter skin than Sub-Saharan Africans? And if so, why? Why the hell are African Americans less dark than Sub-Saharan Africa? Because they are also of African origin, right? Maybe you haven't even asked yourself this question and now you're realizing it's true. Look, let's check out two pictures. Tell me, which one do you think is American and which one do you think is African? Maybe your subconscious has overlooked something that in most cases is more than evident. Why are Sub-Saharans, in general, darker than African Americans? Hey, of course there are always exceptions, don't kill me. But there are reasons for this that we'll explore today. And first of all, let's set another example like the one from before. Did you guess right again? Why could that be? If you've watched the video about the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, you've surely seen that the movie The Last King of Scotland was played by the African-American actor Forest Whitaker. How curious that to play this role they gave him a black face. Basically, they painted his face in black. Or for example, in the acclaimed movie 12 Years a Slave, the role of the African slave Patsy was not played by an African-American actress, but by a Kenyan actress. Were there no valid African-American actresses or what? Beyond clothing and culture, the historical and genetic differences between Sub-Saharans and African Americans are more than evident. And to prevent you from saying that this is just cheap entertainment, let's address it with a bit of rigor. So, without further ado, as you may already know, the black population in North America was once enslaved and brought from Africa. We often make the mistake of thinking that Africa is something like one single homogeneous country. But nothing could be further from the truth. And if in a single African country like Ethiopia you can find people as different as the ones I'm showing you, imagine in the case of an entire continent. African Americans mostly descend from slave people who were brought to America from West Africa, especially from regions like present-day Ghana, Nigeria or Senegal. And in these countries people are diverse. To give you an idea, Senegalese populations tend to have very dark skin, but on the other hand, other peoples of the Gulf of Guinea, like those in Ghana or Ivory Coast, tend to be somewhat lighter, with a more brownish color that closely resembles that of most African Americans. But this can vary a lot among the tribes inhabiting these different countries. Yes, that it happens with African Americans themselves, no two are alike. Even within the American continent, enslaved people did not usually come from the same area. For example, did you know that about 40% of the slaves brought to Americas were taken to Brazil? And while, as I already mentioned, those taken to North America typically came from areas near the Gulf of Guinea, those transferred to Brazil usually came from areas further south, such as the Congo, Mozambique or Angola, with different physical characteristics. And this is why Afro-descendants in Brazil and the US tend to look different. It's also true that Brazil had less strict racial segregation policies and therefore more mixing between whites and blacks. One fundamental thing to understand this topic is to review the roots of the slave trade. First of all, it's worthy briefly highlighting how slaves were captured. Among different African tribes there were often wars, and the victors sold the defeated. Easy. Here's where it gets tricky. The slave trade followed a triangular route between Europe, Africa and the Americas, the so-called transatlantic route or triangular trade. First, from Europe to Africa, where European ships transported goods like weapons, textiles, alcohol and manufactured products to West Africa. Then, from Africa to the Americas. From Africa, ships loaded with enslaved people crossed the Atlantic in what was called the Middle Passage, a brutal journey during which many did not survive. Enslaved people were taken mainly to Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and of course the British colonies in North America. There was a third leg from the Americas to Europe, where ships returned loaded with colonial products like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other goods produced by enslaved labor. In the British colonies of North America, which later became the United States, enslaved people primarily arrived at ports in the south and northeast, where there was a demand for agricultural and domestic labor. The most active port for importation of enslaved people in the southern colonies was Charleston, in present-day South Carolina, where they were sent to rice, tobacco, and cotton plantations. With the prohibition of importing slaves from America in 1808, an internal slave trade emerged within the now independent United States. With the rise of cotton cultivations, slave-holding states in the North and Atlantic regions like Virginia and Maryland began selling enslaved people to the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, the famous southern states, where the demand for labor was very high. The enslaved people were transported by land, rivers, and trains to the new southern states, consolidating slave markets in cities. All in all, the slave trade routes in the US created an economy dependent on the exploitation of millions of African descendant people, which became deeply ingrained in the country's economic and social development. And once we've explained how African Americans came to be and understood that Africa is very diverse and you can compare any African American to just any African, let's get into the truly interesting part. What I've been explaining, it's pretty secondary compared to what I'm going to tell you now. And that's because even though in states like Alabama, officially until the year 2000 whites and blacks couldn't marry, the reality of racial mixing in the United States, and especially in slave-holding regions, it's quite different. And this I have just said is just politely speaking. Well, it's estimated that 80% of African Americans have up to 10% of European blood, and in some specific areas of the US, this percentage can reach up to 25%. And it was very common for slave owners to visit the slave quarters, quite often actually. Genetics is fascinating. An African American might only have 1 out of 32 of European blood and still have relatively light skin. Conversely, they could have a higher percentage of European blood and look as dark as coal. When slave owners abused women and left them pregnant, these children were, in the vast majority of cases, new slaves. Your European blood didn't matter. If you had African blood running through your veins, you were technically African and therefore a slave. That's why it's no surprise that entire African American families might appear mixed race without necessarily having any close European relatives. So, why do African Americans seem to have lighter skin than Sub-Saharan Africans? It can almost entirely be summed up as genetic mixing. Undoubtedly, the history of African populations in the Americas, both in the North and the South, is very interesting and still leaves us with incredible questions to this day. That's it. The history of the New World is interesting, isn't it? If you have any video suggestions, write me. I'm at your service. But don't get used to it. I'm not your slave. Talking about the Middle East is talking about chaos, destruction. But trust me, it hasn't always been like that.
Come and enjoy Lebanon. This paradise is waiting for you with open arms.